When it comes to battleships of the Royal Navy, the Revenge class, or R class or Royal Sovereign class, depending on who you ask, tends to be overlooked. Not quite to the same extent as the ships between Dreadnought and the Queen Elizabeth, but still nowhere near as famous as the Queen Elizabeth or the later fast battleships. In large part, this can be explained by how quiet their service was. Two of the class saw action at Jutland, but beyond that, well, they were far less modernized in the 1930s, so they were less fit for combat action in the Second World War, for better or worse. With this in mind, two of the class are more well known than the others. HMS Royal Oak, the only one sunk in action, sunk in such dramatic fashion that she outshines all her class in her death. And HMS Royal Sovereign, the topic of this video. If there were ever an unlucky ship, one could consider her a fine contender for the title. Missing Jutland in spite of being in service, not once engaging the High Seas Fleet as a result. Being too slow to keep up with HMS Warspite at the Battle of Calabria decades later, and thus missing her chance at the Italian fleet. She saw only second-line service past this point, which is all well and good, but it would end in less than ideal fashion. After all, she is the second best known of her class, due to the absolutely abysmal condition she was in upon return from her loan to the Soviet Union. Of course, no one could have expected that kind of situation when her keel was laid down in 1914. At the time, she was one of the most modern ships in the Royal Navy, and had what seemed like a long and fruitful career ahead of her. It's time we take a look at that career now, and how it eventually saw her end her life unable to even rotate her own turrets. As said, HMS Royal Sovereign was laid down in 1914, on January 15th, 1914 to be exact, the same day that the aforementioned Royal Oak was laid down, which is an interesting historical note. Royal Sovereign would take far longer to complete, however, only launching on April 29th, 1915, and entering service in early May of 1916. The ship that entered service was, at the time, one of the most modern in the world, albeit slower than the Queen Elizabeth class that preceded her. On a hull of roughly 30,000 tons, she carried the same 8 15-inch rifles as the faster battleships. The layout of those guns was, mostly, identical as well, with 2 super-firing pairs. One set on the bow and one on the stern. There were some minor detail differences in the exact layout relating to firing arcs and the like, but those are fairly minor changes. Her secondary battery of 14 6-inch guns were mounted in casemates toward the center of the hull. These were mounted a bit farther back from the bow in comparison to the QEs, which was a deliberate choice to try and mitigate some of the inherent issue in this type of mounting. That is, a choice to try and keep them a bit drier. The rest of her weaponry consisted of the usual smattering of smaller guns, in this case 4 47mm and 2 3-inch anti-aircraft guns. These were joined by the equally traditional underwater torpedo tubes, 4 21-inch mounts in all. It is armor protection and speed where the big differences come in. While carrying the same 13-inch main belt, the layout was changed to offer greater overall protection. I'll cover this in detail when I look at the R class as a whole, but for the purposes of this video, the major change was making it a uniform 13 inches, instead of tapering down to 8 inches below the waterline, as it did on the Queen Elizabeth. As for her speed, well, Royal Sovereign and her class were built as a cheaper alternative to the very expensive Queen Elizabeth. These were shorter ships with less installed power. Initially intended to revert to a mix of coal and oil-fired boilers, Admiral Fisher, upon returning to power, immediately had them switched to only oil. This changed the ships from a design speed of 21 knots to an intended speed of 23. As it would turn out, none of them were quite able to make that speed, operating around 22 knots at best. In the end, though, all of these technical specs were for a ship that saw exactly 0 combat, at least against her intended enemy. Royal Sovereign, as mentioned, entered service in May of 1916. While she was fit for service, though Bert notes she had mechanical issues, her crew was, let's say, not. very inexperienced is what they were. As a result, Jellicoe left her behind when the Grand Fleet set out to what became the Battle of Jutland, which led to her joining Queen Elizabeth in the Modern Battleship Missing Jutland Club. Still, her very entrance into service did serve to further increase the Royal Navy's margin of superiority over the High Seas Fleet. One can argue that Royal Sovereign and her sisters weighed heavily on the German decision to be ever more cautious with their fleet. Regardless of if you believe that or not, the fact is she saw no combat against the Germans, who refused action against the Royal Navy. The absolute closest she came was in August 1916, when the Grand Fleet attempted to catch the High Seas Fleet. Miscommunications and submarine activity led to Jellicoe deciding against risking his fleet, and he pulled back. A further attempt in April 1918 similarly failed to catch the Germans, and was the last time Royal Sovereign had a chance to engage the High Seas Fleet. So, with the end of the Great War, where does that leave Royal Sovereign? Well, she would spend the immediate post-war years keeping an eye on things in Greece and the Black Sea, as the Greco-Turkish War and Russian Civil War kept things fairly chaotic in the area. Following this, and the Washington Treaty cutting the Royal Navy to the bone, Royal Sovereign would join the Atlantic Fleet. Here would come many training missions, port visits, and the usual interwar sort of thing. There she would largely remain for the rest of the 1920s, barring a refit between 1927 and 1929 that mostly consisted of fixing up her machinery and fitting new rangefinders, as well as removing 2 of her 6-inch guns and fitting new 4-inch anti-aircraft weapons. Once she returned to service from this refit, she would swap from Atlantic to Mediterranean, though her missions would remain largely the same. She would remain there until 1935, when she returned to Britain to participate in a fleet review for George V, after which she transferred back to the Atlantic Fleet, and became a formal training vessel, which is reflective of, well, in common with her class, save for Royal Oak to some extent, Royal Sovereign was not refit nor modernized heavily. Smaller and slower than the Queen Elizabeth's, the limited funding and time the Royal Navy had for modernizations was spent on the older battleships. The R-class largely missed this, and Royal Sovereign is no exception. She mostly received detailed changes to her superstructure and increases to her anti-aircraft battery. She did not see any sort of major rebuild. As such, reverting to training duty is almost expected, really. More surprising is that, after a further refit in 1937, she returned to active service with the 2nd Battle Squadron. Royal Sovereign would remain in that position until the Second World War began, though there was a short period where the Royal Navy considered sending the R-class off to Singapore to dissuade the Japanese from any ideas. This was in early 1939, and it was fairly quickly dropped. Good thing, too, as Germany kicked off the Second World War later that year. Probably also a good thing, considering what Japanese air power would do a couple years later. In any event, Royal Sovereign began the war on patrol for German ships trying to sneak back home. Soon enough, her mission would change to escorting convoys to Britain instead, which is a common role for her class. They were, again for the most part, a bit worn out from lack of proper rebuilds, and sometimes struggled to even make 19 knots, let alone their intended speeds. Sufficient for covering a convoy, but not exactly much else. This was driven rather painfully home when in May 1940, Royal Sovereign transferred back to the Mediterranean Fleet. The following months would see her repeatedly miss a chance at engaging the Italian fleet because she just couldn't keep up with the rest of the British forces. First, she was left behind on June 28th when the British charged their cruisers off against Italian destroyers. Then, on July 9th, she was present for the Battle of Calabria, but so slow that she couldn't keep up with Warspite or even Malaya. As a direct result, Warspite took all the glory in that particular engagement. It should come as little surprise that she was soon sent back to Atlantic convoy duty for the remainder of 1940 and the majority of 1941. It was only late that year that she was sent to be a counter to the 3rd major Axis power in the form of Japan. This was part of a general plan that included Force C, intended to keep Japan from getting any ideas. As it would turn out, while Royal Sovereign and her remaining sisters did reach India, they would go no further than that. Okay, well, Royal Sovereign did escort a convoy to Australia in March of 1942. But beyond that, keep in mind this is mid 1942. Japan had already brutalized the American Pacific Fleet and sent the far more capable Prince of Wales, and the at least somewhat more capable Repulse, to the bottom. While the Eastern Fleet would be formed around a pair of fleet carriers in March, it was by no means capable of resisting a concerted attack by the Japanese. These two fleet carriers were the most modern ships it had. HMS Hermes, also present, was old and small. Warspite was the most modern battleship available, and even she couldn't really keep up with the carriers. The four remaining R-class battleships were also present, but while their speeds varied between the ships, they were going to be lucky to manage above 20 knots on a good day. Further, their improved anti-aircraft defenses were still fairly light and outdated for trying to repel Japanese air attack. Frankly, Royal Sovereign was lucky that she was missed in the Indian Ocean raid in April 1942. This saw Hermes sunk alongside two heavy cruisers, among other losses. It also saw the British promptly withdrawing Royal Sovereign and her sisters to Africa, whereupon they would focus on protecting convoys in that portion of the Indian Ocean. Royal Sovereign would see out most of her remaining wartime service in that theater, save for a couple stints in dock in the United States. The first of these, in September 1942, saw her deck armor increased by a couple inches and 4 of her 6-inch guns removed. This was largely a bandage, as she was quickly becoming obsolescent. Even a rebuild akin to Queen Elizabeth wouldn't really have changed that fact. As such, she returned to convoy escort duty for a few months, but saw nothing else of note. A further refit in the United States would soon follow in March 1943 that lasted until September. Once more returning to escort duty, Royal Sovereign would not prove long for this world, at least in Royal Navy service. With her class being pulled from action gradually, Royal Sovereign was sent back to Britain in late 1943, where she was promptly placed into reserve. This is probably where her story would have ended, other than being used for a parts depot, if not for a curious fact. You see, the Soviet Union had been promised portions of the Italian fleet as war reparations. Particularly, they were promised an Italian battleship. Out of an understandable desire to not turn to the Italian co-belligerent government and force them to hand over part of their navy to the Soviets while the war was going on, this couldn't go through, at least not immediately. Instead, Royal Sovereign, in reserve and still in at least somewhat good shape from her last refit, was sent over. On May 30th, 1944, she was assigned to the Soviet Union as a temporary replacement. The handover was something of a party, as both groups were firm allies, and there were no bitter feelings yet. As it would turn out, her service in the Red Navy would serve to sour moods all around. Now, it should be noted here before I go on. While Burt makes no note of Royal Sovereign being in rough shape, I have seen some references to the contrary. Particularly the online navalhistory.net implies her shell handling equipment in her main battery was badly worn out when the United States refit her, and the Americans refused to replace it. Is this actually true? Again, Burt makes no reference to it, and that's a source I'm inclined to trust, especially when he notes that she was more than ready for transfer. I have to caveat, though, that if her turrets were actually in rough shape, the following makes a tad more sense. Regardless, her time in the Red Navy is a bit of a murky topic. Not a whole lot is known, either because the records didn't survive the collapse of the Soviet Union, or no one thought to look for them when Russian archives were easier to access. She was attacked by a U-boat on the way to join the Soviets in August 1944. She would join the Red Navy, formally, on August 29th when her Soviet crew took command. Her remaining wartime service would only consist of meeting up with convoys and escorting them into Soviet ports. Germany was largely spent at this point, and the Soviets didn't send her to the Pacific. Post-war, again, it's hard to say with absolute certainty. She ran aground in the White Sea in 1947, though whatever damage that did isn't known. She was probably used for training roles until the British went up to the Soviets and said, "We would like our battleship back, if you would," in 1949. At this point, the Soviets had the ex-Giulio Cesare, and there was no legal reason to keep Royal Sovereign. The Soviets still tried to hold on to her, though this was likely as much a matter of national pride as anything, with the Cold War starting up. Because, while she was still theoretically the most powerful battleship in the Red Navy, she was not exactly in great shape. Again, I haven't actually found a concrete, firm, cited report on this. It is fairly commonly known and accepted that Royal Sovereign was unable to rotate her turrets. They were never moved in Soviet service, or so the story goes, which would track with the aforementioned quote about the shell handling systems being worn out. Were the turrets actually rusted in place? This is the claim I'm fairly confident in saying is true. But there are other references I've seen, here and there online, about such things as the Soviets stripping out all the parts and equipment that wasn't nailed down, or how the ship was in such a state of disrepair that the Soviets argued she might sink on her return voyage. Another thing I've seen floating about is that the ship was full of vermin, from rats to insects. Perhaps most disgusting would be a reference to her toilets being busted, to the point that unused compartments were turned into lavatories. I will say, thankfully, I haven't seen that particular claim actually cited, because just imagining that makes me wince in sympathy for the poor ship. No matter the truth of the matter, Royal Sovereign was destined for the scrapyard, even had she been in perfect shape upon her return. Her class was already going to be turned into razor blades, and she would soon join them, thoroughly obsolete and never given the kind of rebuild to justify keeping her in service. A sad end for the ship, to be sure, though not an unexpected one. At least she managed to avoid any major mishaps in her Royal Navy service and survive 2 world wars. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the content, and I'll see you in the next one.